Orange, New Jersey, 1920, 5 in the morning. The factory floor is still dark, but the women are already glowing. Traces of luminous powder cling to their hair, their skin, their eyelashes. When they smile, their teeth shimmer with an eerie green light. They call themselves the Ghost Girls, and they think it's beautiful. They have no idea they're watching their own bodies become tombs. 300 women sit at long wooden tables, painting tiny numbers onto watch dials with brushes dipped in the most expensive substance on Earth. The air is thick with invisible particles. The taste is slightly metallic, slightly sweet. They've been told it's harmless. They've been told it might even be good for them. The supervisors wear lead aprons behind glass screens. The chemists use tongs and masks. But the women are instructed to put the brushes in their mouths, to shape the bristles with their lips, to swallow whatever remains. They paint 250 dials a day, each one a tiny masterpiece of precision, each one a dose of poison that will take years to kill them. The company calls the paint Undark. The company promises a future where radium lights the world. Was this the price of American progress or the cost of corporate murder? In the winter of 1898, in a cramped laboratory shed in Paris, a Polish-born scientist named Marie Curie hunched over a bubbling vat of pitch-blende ore. She had been working for months, stirring, filtering, crystallizing, searching for something she could not see. The work was brutal, physically exhausting, and chemically dangerous. But Marie Curie believed there was an undiscovered element hiding in that black mineral sludge, something that made her instruments sing with invisible energy. On December 21st, 1898, she and her husband Pierre announced to the French Academy of Sciences that they had isolated a new radioactive element. They called it radium, from the Latin word for ray. The world would never be the same. The discovery came at a moment when science seemed capable of anything. The previous decade had witnessed X-rays, radioactivity, the electron. Each revelation suggested that matter was far stranger and more powerful than anyone had imagined. Radium fit perfectly into this narrative of scientific triumph, a substance that glowed spontaneously, that emitted energy without apparent fuel, that seemed to violate the most basic laws of physics. The laboratory where the Curies worked was a converted shed with a leaky roof and no insulation. Marie Curie processed ton after ton of pitchblende residue in enormous vats, stirring the slurry with iron rods, her arms aching from the physical labor. The work took 4 years and left her hands permanently scarred from chemical burns. When she finally isolated pure radium, 1/10 of a gram from several tons of ore, the achievement earned her a second Nobel Prize. Her notebooks from this period remain so radioactive that they must be stored in lead-lined boxes. Researchers who wish to examine them must sign waivers acknowledging the radiation risk. The pages carry traces of radium that will persist for centuries. The Curies understood that radium was radioactive, that it emitted some kind of invisible energy, but the full implications remained shrouded in scientific mystery. Pierre Curie strapped a small vial of radium salts to his arm for 10 hours to see what would happen. The skin blistered and burned. He was fascinated. The Curies documented the burn, measured its progression, and watched it heal slowly over weeks. They considered this proof of radium's extraordinary power. What could burn so deeply, they reasoned, might also heal. Medical researchers seized upon this idea with evangelical fervor. If radium could destroy healthy tissue, perhaps it could destroy diseased tissue. Within years, radium was being used experimentally to treat cancer, targeting tumors with concentrated doses of radiation. Early results seemed miraculous. Some tumors shrank, some cancers went into remission. The medical establishment proclaimed radium a wonder element, a gift from the periodic table that might finally conquer humanity's oldest enemy. But radium's appeal extended far beyond medicine. The element glowed with an ethereal blue-green light that captivated everyone who witnessed it. In an era of gaslight and candles, of darkness that fell hard and complete when the sun went down, radium seemed to promise a new world of perpetual illumination. Scientists speculated about radium-powered streetlights, radium-heated homes, radium that would banish the night itself. The element became more than a scientific discovery. It became a symbol of the 20th century's limitless potential. The radium craze swept through American consumer culture with astonishing speed. entrepreneurs marketed radium-infused products for virtually every imaginable purpose. Radium toothpaste promised brighter smiles through radioactive brushing. Radium face creams claimed to restore youthful skin. Radium suppositories were sold to men seeking enhanced virility. Radium hair tonic was advertised as a cure for baldness. None of these products were regulated, and most contained trace amounts of actual radium, enough to glow, enough to fascinate, enough to cause harm that would only become apparent years later. The most popular radium product was Radithor, a patent medicine marketed by William J. Bailey, a Harvard dropout who styled himself as a doctor. Radithor was simply distilled water laced with radium and mesothorium. Bailey claimed it could cure over 150 ailments, from mental illness to impotence. His most famous customer was Eben Byers, a wealthy industrialist and amateur golf champion who drank Radithor daily for years. By 1931, Byers' jaw had disintegrated and holes had formed in his skull. He died in 1932, and his death certificate listed radium poisoning as the cause. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that captured the grim irony. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. The only problem was scarcity. Radium was extraordinarily rare, present in uranium ore at concentrations of roughly 1 part per 200 million. The Curies had processed tons of pitch blendy to extract a single gram. By 1910, that gram was worth more than any other substance on Earth. At its peak, radium commanded prices exceeding $100,000 per gram, the equivalent of roughly $2 million in modern currency. It was more valuable than diamonds, more precious than gold, more coveted than any treasure humanity had ever known. This scarcity created an industry built on paradox, a substance too expensive for most people to afford, yet marketed to consumers as a miracle ingredient in everyday products. The radium content in most commercial goods was homeopathically small, barely enough to register on detection equipment, yet the mere presence of the word radium on a label commanded premium prices. Companies that actually possessed significant quantities of radium guarded them jealously. The element became both commodity and mythology. Its value derived as much from reputation as from any practical application. The processing of radium ore was itself a massive industrial undertaking. For every gram of pure radium extracted, workers had to handle tons of raw ore, crushing it, dissolving it in acid, precipitating it through chemical reactions, concentrating it through dozens of refinement steps. The waste products from this processing, material that still contained radioactive elements, just not enough radium to be economically viable, accumulated in enormous quantities. No one thought much about what to do with this waste. No one imagined it might pose a danger decades after the radium had been extracted. The American radium industry emerged from this perfect storm of scientific wonder, medical promise, and staggering profit. Potential. The element had been found in carnotite ore deposits scattered across the Colorado Plateau, in the Paradox Valley along the Utah border, in remote desert canyons where uranium had accumulated over geological ages. By 1912, American prospectors were shipping raw ore across the Atlantic to European refineries, watching fortunes materialize from yellow rocks pulled from the western wilderness. Dr. Sabin Arnold von Sochoki saw an opportunity that others had missed. Born in Austria-Hungary, educated in Europe, von Sochoki had immigrated to America with dreams that matched the scale of his new country. He was a physician, a chemist, and an entrepreneur, a combination that would prove either brilliant or catastrophic depending on who was counting the bodies. Von Sochoki understood that radium's true commercial potential lay not in medicine but in illumination. He spent years perfecting a formula that mixed minuscule quantities of radium with zinc sulfide, creating a paint that glowed continuously in the dark without requiring any external energy source. The glow was faint but persistent, visible in darkness for years without fading. In 1914, von Sochoki and his partner, George S. Willis, incorporated the Radium Luminous Material Corporation in New York City. The timing seemed accidental, but proved prophetic. That same summer, an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo ignited the First World War, and suddenly every army on Earth desperately needed equipment that could be read in the dark. Soldiers in trenches needed watches that glowed through the smoke and mud. Pilots in open cockpits needed instrument panels visible in moonless skies. Naval officers needed compasses and gauges that didn't betray their positions with light. The military contracts were enormous. The United States Navy alone required thousands of luminous instrument dials, compasses, and gauges for its ships and submarines. The Army needed watches, aircraft instruments, artillery sights, and navigation equipment, all painted with radioluminescent compound that would glow reliably in the field. By the end of World War I, American factories had produced more than 4 million watches and clocks with radium-painted dials. The industry that had seemed like a scientific novelty in 1914 had become essential to military operations. Von Sochocki named his luminous paint Undark. The marketing materials promised that Undark would make night vision possible for everyone, that it would revolutionize transportation and warfare and daily life. What the marketing materials didn't mention was that every brushstroke of Undark contained particles of one of the most dangerous substances ever discovered. Particles that would embed themselves in bone and blood and marrow. Particles that would continue emitting radiation for thousands of years. The paint formula was straightforward. Radium salts mixed with zinc sulfide and gum arabic adhesive, creating a compound that phosphoresced continuously without external light. The concentration of radium was tiny, micrograms per gram of paint, but the cumulative exposure from daily handling proved catastrophic. The Orange Factory opened in 1917, 4 days after the United States declared war on Germany. The timing was not coincidental. Von Sochocki had secured military contracts worth millions, and he needed workers to fulfill them, workers with small hands and steady nerves, workers who could paint precise numbers onto dials smaller than quarters. He found them in the neighborhoods surrounding his New Jersey facility. Young women, mostly teenagers, many still in high school or recently graduated. Immigrants and first-generation Americans. Working-class girls who had few options and fewer opportunities. They came seeking what the factory promised: steady wages, respectable work, and a chance to contribute to the war effort. The factory itself occupied a 2-acre site at the corner of High and Alden Streets. The main building was a utilitarian industrial structure: brick walls, large windows for natural light, high ceilings to disperse fumes. Inside, the dial painting studio filled a large room on the second floor. Long wooden tables stretched in rows, each table accommodating a dozen workers. Natural light flooded through banks of windows, essential for the precise work of painting microscopic numerals. The facility represented both the promise and the peril of progressive-era industry. On one hand, it offered unprecedented opportunities for young women: steady employment, decent wages, respectable work that didn't require domestic service or factory labor under brutal conditions. On the other hand, it operated in an era when worker safety was essentially an afterthought, when no federal agency monitored workplace hazards, when employers faced few legal consequences for exposing employees to dangerous conditions. The dial painters occupied a strange middle ground: skilled enough to command premium wages, yet vulnerable enough to be sacrificed when their health became inconvenient. The pay was remarkable for the era. Dial painters earned roughly 3 times what they could make in other factory jobs, around $15 to $20 per week, paid by the piece. The rate was about a penny and a half per dial, which meant a skilled painter needed to complete 250 dials per shift to earn a decent wage. The work required extraordinary precision. The luminous compound had to be applied to tiny numerals and hands, each stroke visible, each digit legible in absolute darkness. Quality control was ruthless. The workers were young, some as young as 14, lying about their ages to get hired. They were listed as artists in town directories, a designation that carried social prestige in their working-class communities. Their wages supported families, paid for younger siblings' educations, funded modest dowries and marriage hopes. The dial painting studio was not merely a workplace but a social institution, a gathering place where young women formed friendships and shared gossip and dreamed about futures that radium would steal from them. Each painter had her own workspace: a small crucible for mixing paint, a tray of watch dials waiting to be finished, and a selection of fine camel hair brushes. The brushes were the critical tools, delicate instruments that required constant maintenance to keep their tips sharp enough for precision work. After just a few strokes, the bristles would splay and fray, making accurate painting impossible. The solution was elegant and fatal. Supervisors instructed the painters to point the brush tips with their lips, rolling the bristles between tongue and teeth to restore their fine points. The technique was called lip pointing, and it was mandatory. Using rags or water to clean the brushes wasted time and material, and time was money. Material was profit. A dial painter who took extra seconds to rinse. Her brush between strokes might complete only 200 dials in a shift instead of 250. That difference translated to lost wages for her and lost revenue for the company. The painters were told the paint was harmless. They were told the radium was so diluted it couldn't possibly hurt them. Some were even told that radium was healthful, that it would improve their complexions and strengthen their constitutions. Von Sochaki himself reportedly assured workers that radium was beneficial in small doses, that the glowing powder they handled daily would do them nothing but good. This was not ignorance, but deception. The scientific literature of the time contained ample evidence of radium's dangers. Marie Curie's deteriorating health was well known in scientific circles. Pierre Curie had documented the burns that radium inflicted on his skin. Medical researchers had described cases of radiation injury among people who handled radioactive materials. The dangers were not fully understood, but they were recognized, at least by those who cared to look. The contrast between how the company treated different categories of workers made the deception even more damning. In the chemistry laboratory, just down the hall from the dial painting studio, researchers handled radium with elaborate precautions. They wore lead aprons to block radiation. They worked behind glass shields. They used long-handled tongs to manipulate radioactive samples. They never touched radium directly, never allowed it near their skin, never breathed its dust if they could avoid it. Yet the women were instructed to put the brushes in their mouths. The women believed what they were told. Why wouldn't they? Radium products were everywhere in American life. Pharmacies sold radium tonics and radium water. Department stores carried radium face creams and radium toothpaste. Wealthy patrons visited radium spas to soak in radioactive mineral baths. If radium was dangerous, surely the government would have said something. Surely doctors would have warned them. Surely their employers wouldn't deliberately poison them. The factory became a kind of wonderland for the young women who worked there. They painted not just watch dials, but their own fingernails, their buttons, their teeth. They dusted their hair and their dresses with the luminous powder, creating outfits that sparkled in the darkness like constellations. At dances and parties, the dial painters stood out, literally, from other young women. Their clothes sparkled, their faces shimmered, their very presence announced that they worked with the most expensive substance on Earth. The radioactive contamination that was slowly killing them also gave them a kind of glamour. Some of the women noticed that strange things happened when they went home after work. Grace Fryer noticed that when she blew her nose, her handkerchief glowed in the dark. The luminous powder had accumulated in her nasal passages, in her sinuses, in all the moist cavities where it could collect. She mentioned it to colleagues, but no one thought much of it. Researchers would later calculate that a dial painter who pointed her brush an average of 14 times per dial, painting 250 dials per shift, might ingest between 125 milligrams and 1 3/4 grams of paint daily. The paint contained only trace amounts of radium, micrograms per gram, but even micrograms of radium represented substantial radioactivity. A single microgram of radium-226 undergoes roughly 2.7 million radioactive decays per minute. The painters were swallowing millions of miniature explosions every day. Grace Fryer was 18 years old when she started painting dials on April 10, 1917, 4 days after the United States entered the war. She came from a political family. Her father was a union representative, and she brought that same fierce spirit to everything she did. Grace was intelligent, capable, and driven. Her supervisors recognized her potential and promoted her to training other painters, teaching new recruits the lip-pointing technique that would eventually kill them. Amelia Maggia, known to everyone as Molly, was also 18 when she joined the Orange Factory. She was the fourth of 7 sisters, several of whom followed her into the dial painting studio. Molly was exceptional at her work, fast, precise, and cheerful. She earned top wages and supported her family with her income. Her younger sisters, Quinta and Albina, joined the company shortly after, hoping to share in her success. Catherine Schaub was just 14 when she started painting dials in February 1917, lying about her age to get hired. She was described as imaginative and literary, dreaming of becoming a writer. The factory floor seemed like a temporary detour on the way to something better. She became an instructress, teaching the lip-pointing technique to dozens of other young women. Edna Hussman was quiet and hardworking, the daughter of an English immigrant mother and an American engineer father. She lived in a small bungalow that she and her husband struggled to afford. The dial painting wages helped make ends meet, helped build the life she hoped to have. These women knew each other, worked alongside each other, shared meals and jokes and dreams. They had no way of knowing that they were being systematically poisoned, that every brushstroke was delivering invisible death into their bodies, that the company paying their wages understood the danger and said nothing. In August 1921, the original Radium Luminous Material Corporation was reorganized. Von Sochocki was forced out of the presidency after a power struggle with investors. The company was renamed the United States Radium Corporation, and Arthur Roeder became president. But the fundamental operation continued unchanged. The same paints, the same techniques, the same lies. The symptoms began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide creeping up a beach. First came the dental problems, aching teeth that couldn't be explained, loose teeth that fell out unexpectedly, toothaches that seemed to migrate from jaw to jaw. The dial painters assumed it was normal, wear and tear. Molly Maga's troubles started in 1921, about 4 years after she began painting dials. A tooth started hurting, then two, then more. Her dentist pulled them, but the sockets refused to heal. Instead, they oozed blood and pus, filling her mouth with a foul taste that never went away. The dentist was puzzled. He had never seen wounds that simply wouldn't close. At first, the problem seemed ordinary, the kind of dental troubles that afflicted many working-class people in an era before fluoridated water and regular dental care. Molly came from an Italian immigrant family without money for expensive specialists. Tooth extractions that should have healed in days remained open weeks later. Infections that should have responded to treatment persisted and spread. By early 1922, Molly's condition had deteriorated catastrophically. The mysterious infection had spread from her teeth to her jaw, then to the roof of her mouth, then to the bones of her inner ear. Her entire lower face had become, according to medical reports, one large abscess. The pain was constant and excruciating. She could barely eat, barely sleep, barely speak. Doctors consulted each other, examined her repeatedly, proposed various diagnoses. Some suggested phosphorus poisoning, a known occupational disease among workers in match factories. But Molly had never worked with matches. No one connected her symptoms to the glowing powder she had handled for 4 years. During one examination in May 1922, her dentist probed her jawbone to assess the extent of the damage. When he touched the bone, barely touched it, with the gentlest possible pressure, it crumbled under his finger. The bone simply disintegrated, falling apart like wet chalk. The doctor reached into Molly's mouth and lifted out her entire jawbone with nothing but his fingers. There was no surgery, no cutting, no resistance. The radium had eaten the bone from the inside out, replacing solid structure with honeycombed ruin. Over the next few months, doctors removed what remained of Molly Maga's jaw. They extracted pieces of her skull. They watched helplessly as tumors grew and multiplied. On September 12, 1922, just before her 25th birthday, Molly Maga died. A tumor had grown into her jugular vein, and she choked to death on her own blood. Her death certificate listed the cause as ulcerative stomatitis, inflammation of the mouth. Later, someone would quietly amend it to syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection, a disease of loose women and moral failure, a diagnosis that protected the company and destroyed whatever remained of Molly Maga's reputation. Molly was the first, but she was not the last. By the time she died, other dial painters were already showing symptoms. Grace Fryer had developed mysterious aches in her feet and legs. Her teeth had started loosening. Her spine had begun to deteriorate, and she found herself needing a back brace just to sit upright. Catherine Schaub was having similar problems: joint pain, dental decay, a general sense that her body was failing her in ways she couldn't understand. The company noticed. Workers died at an alarming rate, 4 in 1922 alone, then more in 1923, then more in 1924. Each death was attributed to something else: infection, anemia, syphilis, phosphorus poisoning, anything but radium, anything but the paint. When concerned families and public health officials began asking questions, U.S. Radium Corporation responded with studied innocence. The company commissioned a study from Cecil and Catherine Drinker, respected researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health, asking them to investigate conditions at the orange factory. The choice of the Drinkers seemed designed to produce a favorable result. A prestigious academic institution lending its credibility to findings the company hoped would exonerate it. What the company didn't anticipate was that the Drinkers would follow the evidence wherever it led. The Drinkers conducted a thorough examination in 1924, spending weeks at the facility, interviewing workers, collecting samples, measuring radiation levels. They observed the dial painters at work, watched them lip point their brushes, documented the contamination that permeated the studio. They drew blood from workers and analyzed it for abnormalities. They tested surfaces and air samples for radioactive particles. Their methodology was rigorous, their credentials unimpeachable, their findings devastating. The factory was heavily contaminated. Radioactive dust saturated the air, coated the surfaces, permeated the workers' clothing and skin. Blood tests revealed that virtually every dial painter showed abnormalities, consistent with radiation exposure. Some workers already had advanced bone necrosis. The Drinkers' report was clear. The employees' continuous exposure to radium was causing their health problems. The lip-pointing practice was delivering lethal doses directly into their bodies. The Drinkers expected their report would lead to immediate reforms. They assumed the company had commissioned their study in good faith, genuinely seeking to understand and address workplace hazards. They were wrong. Arthur Roeder received the report and rejected its conclusions. He demanded that the Drinkers alter their findings to show the company in a better light. When they refused, he threatened to sue them if they published. The Drinkers initially acquiesced, suppressing their own research to avoid legal entanglement. But word of the deception reached Alice Hamilton, a pioneering occupational health researcher at Harvard. Hamilton discovered that Roeder had submitted a falsified version of the Drinker report to the New Jersey Department of Labor, a version that concealed the dangers and exonerated the company. The cover-up extended beyond manipulated research. U.S. Radium Corporation deployed every weapon at its disposal to suppress the truth and discredit the victims. When workers reported symptoms, company doctors dismissed their concerns or misattributed them to other causes. The company's strategy was sophisticated and cynical. First, delay. The longer it took for the connection between radium and illness to be established, the more victims would die before they could seek compensation, the more the statute of limitations would run out on potential claims. Second, confuse. By producing contradictory research, the company could create doubt where none should have existed. Third, defame. By attributing victims' illnesses to shameful causes, the company could discourage sympathy and deter litigation. In the 1920s, a woman's virtue was her most precious social asset. An accusation of promiscuity could destroy not just the woman herself, but her entire family. Employers wouldn't hire the sisters of fallen women. Suitors wouldn't court the daughters of disgraced families. Frederick Flynn appeared frequently in the company's defense. He examined dial painters and pronounced them healthy. He testified that their ailments had nothing to do with radium exposure. He was presented to the press and the public as an independent medical authority. What the press and public didn't know was that Flynn had no medical license. He was not a doctor. He was paid by U.S. Radium Corporation to provide exactly the conclusions the company needed. The syphilis diagnoses served a particularly cruel purpose. By labeling dead dial painters as syphilis victims, the company provided an alternative explanation for their symptoms, deflected suspicion from the workplace, and destroyed the reputations of women who might otherwise have become sympathetic victims. Dead girls couldn't defend themselves. The Maggia family endured whispers and sideways glances after Molly's death certificate was amended. The company had found a way to kill these women and then kill them again, destroying their names along with their bodies. Dr. Harrison Stanford Martland was the chief medical examiner of Essex County, New Jersey, a pathologist with a reputation for rigorous science and stubborn independence. In 1924, word of the mysterious deaths at the Orange Factory reached his office, and Martland began his own investigation. Unlike the company's paid consultants, Martland had no financial interest in the outcome. He followed the evidence wherever it led. Martland had trained at Columbia University's medical school, served in World War I, and built a reputation for meticulous forensic work. He understood how to gather evidence, how to test hypotheses, how to separate speculation from proof. He also understood that corporate interests would oppose any findings that threatened their profits. The evidence led directly to radium. Martland examined workers who had developed the strange bone deterioration that doctors had started calling radium jaw. He tested their breath and found that they were exhaling radon gas, a radioactive decay product of radium that proved the element had deposited in their bodies. He examined tissue samples and found them saturated with radioactive particles. He developed techniques for measuring body burden, the total amount of radium that had accumulated in a person's system, and discovered that some dial painters carried hundreds of times the amount that would later be established as safe. Martland's breath test was elegantly simple. Radium-226, when it decays, produces radon-222, an inert gas that diffuses from bones into the bloodstream and is exhaled through the lungs. By collecting a patient's breath in a sealed chamber and measuring its radioactivity, Martland could determine whether radium had deposited in the whole body. The test required no surgery, no extraction of tissue, no invasion of the patient's body. The victims exhaled the evidence of their poisoning. In December 1925, Martland published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association under the title Some Unrecognized Dangers in the Use and Handling of Radioactive Substances. The paper described a new occupational disease, radium necrosis. It explained how ingested radium mimicked calcium in the body, depositing in bones where it emitted continuous radiation that destroyed tissue from within. It documented the progression from dental problems to jaw necrosis to systemic cancer. The publication sent shockwaves through the medical community. Martland's credentials were impeccable. This was not a paid consultant, but an independent public official. The radium industry scrambled to respond, but the connection could no longer be plausibly denied. Grace Fryer read about Martland's research and recognized her own symptoms in his clinical descriptions. By 1925, she had left the dial painting industry and taken a job as a bank teller, but her health continued to deteriorate. Her teeth fell out one by one. Her spine compressed so severely that she lost several inches of height. She needed a steel back brace to sit upright and could barely walk without assistance. She was 26 years old and dying. Grace decided to sue. The decision was not simple or obvious. U.S. Radium Corporation was a powerful company with expensive lawyers and friends in government. Grace was a working-class woman with no money and diminishing strength. New Jersey's statute of limitations for workplace injuries was just 2 years, and Grace had left the factory in 1920, 5 years before she learned the true cause of her illness. The legal obstacles seemed insurmountable. Workers' compensation laws of the era barely recognized occupational disease as a category. Most workplace injury laws focused on accidents, sudden events, with clear causes and immediate consequences. A worker who fell from scaffolding could claim compensation because the injury was obvious, but a worker who developed cancer years after exposure to a hazardous substance faced enormous barriers. How could she prove the cancer came from work and not from other causes? How could she overcome the statute of limitations when her disease didn't manifest until long after she left employment? For 2 years, Grace searched for an attorney willing to take her case. Lawyer after lawyer declined. Some feared retaliation from the company. Some doubted the case could be won. Some simply didn't want to represent a dying woman in a fight against corporate power. The lawyers who refused had legitimate concerns. U.S. Radium Corporation could afford to delay proceedings indefinitely. The statute of limitations defense might succeed despite the obvious injustice. Even if a jury awarded damages, appeals could postpone payment for years the plaintiffs didn't have. In May 1927, Grace finally found Raymond Berry, a young Newark attorney just beginning his career. Berry was willing to take the case on contingency, no fees unless they won, and he was willing to fight. He understood that the case was about more than 5 sick women seeking compensation. It was about whether corporations could poison workers with impunity, whether the law protected the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Barry recognized that winning the case would require more than legal arguments. He would need to generate public pressure to transform the dial painters from anonymous factory workers into sympathetic figures whose suffering demanded justice. He coordinated with reporters, arranged for photographs of the plaintiffs, ensured that the human cost of corporate negligence would be visible to everyone who read a newspaper. The strategy was as much about public relations as about jurisprudence. 4 other dial painters joined the lawsuit: Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and the Maggia sisters, Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice. Together, they demanded $250,000 each in damages. The plaintiffs were painfully aware of their own mortality. Doctors had given them months to live, perhaps a year at most. But the company knew the same facts and drew the opposite conclusion. Delay served its interests. Every month of legal maneuvering brought the plaintiffs closer to death. The lawsuit became national news. Newspapers across the country covered the story of 5 young women facing death while fighting a corporate giant. The press dubbed them the Radium Girls, a name that captured both their ethereal glow and their tragic fate. Reporters interviewed the plaintiffs, photographed them in their wheelchairs and back braces, documented the visible evidence of their deterioration. The coverage generated enormous public sympathy. These were not abstractions, but real women with names and faces. They had done nothing wrong except trust their employer. U.S. Radium Corporation deployed its full legal arsenal. Company attorneys argued that the statute of limitations had expired. They argued that the company had not known radium was dangerous. They hired expert witnesses to contradict Martlin's findings. They attempted to delay proceedings indefinitely. The first court appearance came in January 1928. By then, the 5 women were so weak they could barely raise their arms to take the oath. Grace Fryer had lost all her teeth and could not sit without her back brace. Raymond Barry called a critical witness. Elizabeth Hughes, a physicist who had once worked at the National Bureau of Standards and had consulted for U.S. Radium Corporation itself. Her testimony was devastating. All 5 women were exhaling radioactive gases. Their bodies had become so saturated with radium that they were literally radioactive. The case dragged on through the spring of 1928, with the company requesting delays and adjournments while the plaintiffs weakened. Then a reporter for the Newark Star-Eagle discovered something remarkable. The company had already paid settlements to families of dead dial painters, quiet, confidential payments made years earlier. In 1926, U.S. Radium Corporation had distributed $13,000 to 3 families whose daughters had died from radium poisoning. The company had admitted liability through its actions while denying it in court. Barry made another crucial move. He persuaded Molly Maggia's family to allow her body to be exhumed. 5 years after her death, Molly's remains were disinterred and taken to a mortuary for examination. The body was in remarkably good condition for having been buried 5 years, a fact that some attributed to the preservative properties of the radium that saturated her tissues. Every tissue sample was radioactive. Bone fragments glowed. Marrow samples registered on detection equipment. The radium that Molly had swallowed, while painting watch dials, had spread throughout her skeleton. Her body contained 48.4 micrograms of radium, 500 times what would later be established as the maximum safe body burden. The syphilis diagnosis that had stained Molly's memory was definitively disproved. No sexually transmitted infection could cause the specific pattern of bone destruction documented in her remains. The company's attempt to protect itself by smearing a dead woman's reputation collapsed in the face of physical evidence that could not be denied. Public pressure intensified. Walter Lippmann, the influential editor of the New York World, turned his newspaper's attention to the case, demanding justice for the dying women. Labor organizations and consumer groups rallied to the plaintiffs' cause. Politicians began asking uncomfortable questions about corporate accountability. In June 1928, U.S. Radium Corporation agreed to settle. Each of the 5 women would receive $10,000 in cash, plus $600 per year for the rest of their lives, plus coverage of all medical and legal expenses. The settlement represented a fraction of what the women had demanded, roughly 4% of their original claim, but It was all they could realistically expect. None of them was expected to live more than 2 years. There was one final, cruel discovery. The judge who had presided over much of the case, U.S. District Court Judge William Clark, was revealed to be a stockholder in U.S. Radium Corporation. The man responsible for scheduling delays that allowed the plaintiffs to weaken had a personal financial interest in the defendant's success. The Radium girls lived briefly after the settlement. Quinta McDonald died in December 1929. Grace Fryer died in October 1933, her body so fragile that bones snapped with minimal pressure. Catherine Schaub died the same year. Albina Larice survived until 1946, but she was an invalid for most of those years. None of them lived to see old age. None of them saw the full consequences of their sacrifice. But their lawsuit had changed history. For the first time, an employer had been held accountable for occupational disease. Workers had proven that companies had a duty to protect employees from hazards, even hazards the employees themselves didn't understand. The case established precedents that would eventually lead to comprehensive workplace safety legislation, to the creation of agencies like OSHA, to the recognition that worker health was not merely a private matter between employer and employee, but a public concern requiring government protection. The Orange factory closed in 1927, a few months after Grace Fryer filed her lawsuit. U.S. Radium Corporation consolidated its operations in Manhattan, but the company didn't disappear. It adapted. When World War II erupted, demand for luminous instruments surged again, and the company expanded to employ 1,000 workers across facilities in Pennsylvania, California, and New York. This time, the company took precautions. The Radium Girls lawsuit and Martlin's research had made safety protocols unavoidable. Workers were no longer instructed to lip-point brushes. Protective equipment became standard. Medical monitoring identified exposure before it became lethal. The dial painting industry continued for decades, but it never again operated with the casual disregard for human life that had characterized the Orange factory. Dr. Sabin Arnold von Sokocki died in November 1928. Just months after the settlement with the Radium Girls. He had developed aplastic anemia from his own exposure to the element he had championed. The man who had assured workers that radium was harmless became the 16th known victim of radium dial painting. He was 45 years old. Arthur Roeder, the company president who had suppressed the drinker report and fought the lawsuit, faced no legal consequences. He continued in business, continued in society, continued to live while the women he had poisoned died. The men who made the decisions experienced nothing resembling justice. The scientific legacy of the Radium Girls extended far beyond workplace safety. Martlin's research helped establish the entire field of radiation protection. His techniques for measuring body burden became standard procedures for nuclear research. His documentation of how radioactive materials behave in the human body informed the safety protocols of the Manhattan Project, the nuclear power industry, and medical radiation therapy. The dial painters became, unwillingly and unknowingly, the most thoroughly studied cohort of radiation exposure victims in history. The Argonne National Laboratory established a long-term study tracking thousands of former radium workers, measuring their body burdens, documenting their health outcomes, correlating exposure levels with disease. This research continued for decades, generating data that proved invaluable for establishing radiation safety standards. The women who had been deceived and poisoned by their employer became, in death, teachers whose bodies revealed the secrets of radioactive damage. The Center for Human Radiobiology, established at Argonne in 1968, made the former dial painters its primary research focus. Scientists tracked down women who had worked in the radium industry decades earlier, measured their body burdens, documented their health histories. Some of these women had left the industry in the 1920s and suffered no apparent ill effects. Others had developed cancers 30 or 40 years after exposure. The research revealed the long latency period of radiation-induced disease, the way radioactive elements could lie dormant in bone for decades before triggering malignancies. The key insight from the Radium Girls tragedy was that radioactive materials behave differently inside the body than outside it. External radiation exposure can be managed through time, distance, and shielding. But internal contamination, radioactive particles that have been swallowed, inhaled, or absorbed, cannot be removed. Once radium deposits in bone, it stays there, emitting radiation continuously into surrounding tissue for the rest of the victim's life. The cumulative nature of radiation injury had not been fully appreciated before the radium cases made it undeniable. When the United States began developing atomic weapons in the 1940s, scientists understood the dangers they faced partly because of what had happened in Orange, New Jersey. Louis Hempelman, the chief medical officer at Los Alamos, visited radium dial factories to observe safety procedures before establishing protocols for plutonium handling. The lessons written in the bones of dead dial painters helped protect a new generation of nuclear workers. The standards for radiation exposure that protect workers today, the permissible dose limits, the monitoring requirements, the safety procedures, trace their origins to the suffering of the dial painters. Every nuclear facility that operates safely, every medical radiation treatment that minimizes unnecessary exposure, every regulatory framework that limits workplace contamination, owes something to the women who died in Orange, New Jersey. But knowledge alone couldn't undo what had been done to them. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. The particles deposited in the bones of dial painters in 1917 were still radioactive when their grandchildren were born. In 1987, 65 years after Molly Maggia died, researchers tested her grave with Geiger counters and detected elevated radiation. She was still glowing. The physical contamination from U.S. Radium Corporation's operations spread far beyond the factory walls. While the company operated, it processed roughly half a ton of carnotite ore per day, extracting tiny quantities of radium and disposing of the radioactive waste on site. Over 9 years, approximately 1,600 tons of contaminated material accumulated at the Orange facility. When the factory closed, no one cleaned up the mess. In the decades after the factory closed, the surrounding area was developed. Houses were built on contaminated soil. Roads were paved with radioactive fill. Families moved into homes that were slowly poisoning them, raising children in yards that emitted invisible radiation. No one told them. No one knew. The contamination wasn't discovered until 1979, when the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection began systematically investigating former radium processing sites. House after house tested positive. Some homes had radon concentrations dozens of times higher than safety thresholds. Residents had been living in radioactive environments for decades. In 1983, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency designated the U.S. Radium Corporation site as a Superfund cleanup priority. EPA investigators surveyed the area, testing soil samples, measuring radiation levels. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The contamination radiated outward from the factory site. Fill dirt had been used in construction projects throughout Orange and neighboring communities. A Girl Scout camp in the area had elevated radiation levels. A parking lot in West Orange sat on top of radium waste. Residential gardens grew vegetables in soil laced with radioactive particles. The invisible legacy of the dial painting industry had spread through the fabric of suburban life, contaminating spaces where families lived and children played. The cleanup required a systematic survey of the entire region. EPA teams went house to house with detection equipment, measuring gamma radiation, testing soil, checking basements and crawl spaces. Some properties required only minor remediation. Removal of contaminated topsoil, replacement with clean fill. Others required extensive excavation, removal of foundations that had been mixed with radioactive waste, rebuilding from the ground up. The logistics were staggering, relocating families during remediation, coordinating with local utilities, managing the transportation of radioactive material across state lines to licensed disposal facilities. The cleanup also raised difficult questions about liability and compensation. The company that had caused the contamination no longer existed in any meaningful form. Property owners whose homes sat on radioactive waste had purchased in good faith, unaware of the history beneath their foundations. Insurance companies disputed claims, banks questioned property values. The environmental contamination created economic contamination as well, affecting property markets and municipal tax bases throughout the affected area. The cleanup took more than 2 decades and cost nearly $250 million. Beginning in 1990, EPA crews excavated contaminated soil from the former factory site and from more than 250 residential and commercial properties. Workers in hazmat suits became a familiar sight in neighborhoods where children played. By 2005, all cleanup and restoration activities were complete. The former factory site was transformed into a park. Historians estimate that approximately 4,000 workers were hired by radium dial companies across the United States and Canada. The true death toll will never be known. Many workers died before their conditions were diagnosed. Many were misclassified. Many simply disappeared into anonymity. The tragedy was not limited to New Jersey. In Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company operated a similar facility employing local women under similar conditions. When word of the New Jersey lawsuits reached Illinois, company management assured workers that their paint was different. This was a lie. All radioluminescent paint contained dangerous radioactive materials. The Illinois women faced an even more hostile legal environment than their New Jersey counterparts. Illinois law at the time provided no workers' compensation coverage for occupational diseases, only for injuries from specific accidents. A woman who lost a finger in a machine could claim compensation. A woman whose bones were destroyed by radium could not. The Radium Dial Company exploited this legal gap ruthlessly, fighting every claim with expensive lawyers and expert witnesses. Catherine Wolfe Donahue became the leader of the Illinois dial painters' fight for justice. Like Grace Fryer before her, Catherine was determined to hold her employer accountable. She had started painting dials in 1922, drawn by the good wages and the glamour of working with radium. By the early 1930s, she was showing the familiar symptoms: dental problems, jaw deterioration, bone pain that never stopped. Her case took longer than the New Jersey litigation and proved even more difficult. The Radium Dial Company employed aggressive legal tactics, arguing that the statute of limitations had expired, that the workers had assumed the risks of their employment, that the company bore no responsibility for diseases that manifested years after employment ended. By 1938, Catherine was dying. A tumor the size of a grapefruit bulged from her hip. Her jaw had crumbled. She could barely move, barely speak, but she insisted on testifying. When she was too sick to travel, the Illinois Industrial Commission convened at her bedside, taking her testimony as she lay dying. The scene was documented by reporters and photographers, a woman literally giving her last breath to hold her employer accountable. Catherine Donahue won her case. She died in 1938, just months after the favorable ruling. In 1939, the Illinois Supreme Court rejected the company's final appeal, establishing a definitive precedent that radium dial companies could be held liable for worker injuries. For decades, the dial painters existed primarily in specialized literature. Then, in 1987, researcher Claudia Clark published a comprehensive academic study that brought renewed attention to the case. In 2017, Kate Moore published The Radium Girls: The Dark Story of America's Shining Women, a popular narrative that brought the dial painters to mainstream awareness. The book became a bestseller and introduced a new generation to the story. Moore's accessible prose and detailed research made the dial painters human in ways that academic studies had not. Theatrical productions followed. D.W. Gregory's play, Radium Girls, was performed across the country, dramatizing Grace Fryer's lawsuit and its aftermath. High schools and community theaters staged the play, introducing young people to a history they had never encountered. The 2020 film Radium Girls brought the story to screens worldwide. The dial painters had become folk heroes of a sort, ordinary women who had fought extraordinary injustice and won, however partially. Their story resonated with contemporary concerns about corporate power, worker safety, and the rights of individuals against institutions. The timing of this cultural revival was not accidental. The 1980s and 1990s saw renewed public interest in corporate accountability, environmental justice, and worker safety. The Superfund cleanup of the former U.S. radium site brought the story back to local news. Debates over nuclear power and radioactive waste disposal made radiation hazards newly relevant. The dial painters' tragedy resonated with contemporary concerns in ways that had been less apparent in earlier decades. Today, the former U.S. Radium Corporation site in Orange, New Jersey, shows no visible trace of its toxic past. Grass grows where radium once accumulated. The cemetery where Molly Maggia and her sisters are buried remains a site of pilgrimage for those who know the story. The watches those women painted have become collector's items. Vintage radium dials still glow faintly, their luminescence diminished by decay but not extinguished. U.S. Radium Corporation itself no longer exists. Through decades of reorganization, the company transformed into Safety Light Corporation. The Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania facility, where later operations were based, became its own Superfund site in 2005. The fundamental questions the Radium Girls raised remain contested in industries around the world. Who is responsible when workers are harmed? What obligations do corporations owe their employees? How should society balance profit against safety? Agricultural workers exposed to pesticides, factory workers breathing toxic fumes, warehouse employees injured by demanding productivity quotas, all face versions of the same dynamics. The dial painters established the fundamental principle that employers have a duty to protect workers from occupational hazards, even hazards the workers themselves don't understand. They demonstrated that independent scientific research is essential. Without Harrison Martlin's investigation, without the drinkers' findings, the dial painters would have had no evidence to support their claims. The tension between industry research and independent research continues today in debates over pharmaceuticals, chemicals, environmental hazards, and countless other public health questions. The Radium Girls also demonstrated that industry-funded studies must be viewed with skepticism, that researchers who receive corporate money may reach conclusions favorable to their funders, that the appearance of scientific objectivity can mask financial conflicts of interest. These lessons have been applied repeatedly in subsequent decades, in tobacco litigation, in pharmaceutical regulation, in environmental enforcement, in every context where corporate interests conflict with public health. Perhaps most importantly, the case illustrated the importance of worker solidarity and public advocacy. Grace Fryer and her fellow plaintiffs succeeded not just because they had good lawyers and strong evidence, but because they were willing to make their suffering public to transform private tragedy into political pressure. They understood that corporations respond to reputational damage as much as to legal liability, that public opinion can be a powerful weapon even when the law seems stacked against workers. Grace Fryer was a bank teller, not a lawyer or politician. She had no special resources, no influential connections. She had only determination and the truth. She and her fellow plaintiffs knew they were dying. They knew they would likely not survive to see the outcome of their lawsuit. They chose to fight anyway, not for themselves, since no monetary settlement could restore their health, but for future workers who might be protected by the precedents they established. Their names were Grace and Molly, and Catherine and Edna, and Quinta and Albina, and hundreds of others lost to history. They were teenagers and young women, daughters and sisters and wives. They worked hard and followed instructions and trusted the people who employed them. Some of them are still radioactive. Nearly a century after Molly Maggia died, her remains continued emitting radiation. The element she swallowed while painting watch dials in 1917 has not finished decaying. It will not finish for another 1,500 years. The watches they painted still tell time. Some hang in museums, behind glass, with warning labels about their radioactive content. Each one represents hours of labor performed by women who didn't know they were dying. They didn't get what they deserved, but they got something. Recognition, eventually, acknowledgement that they had been wronged, legal precedents that protected future workers, scientific knowledge that saved future lives, a place in history that ensures they will not be forgotten. The Ghost Girls are gone now. The last survivors of the dial painting era died decades ago, carrying their radium burdens to the grave. But the questions remain. Who decides which lives matter? Who pays when industry kills? Who remembers when the powerful prefer to forget? They cannot answer. They are dead, most of them for nearly a century now. But their silence speaks louder than any testimony. They were there, in Orange, New Jersey, in the early years of the 20th century. They worked hard and trusted completely and died horribly. And all we can do is remember and learn and refuse to let it happen again.